Hello everyone, my name is Vivian and I'm a 3D artist for games. I started my journey into this space with very little experience with digital art, if any at all. Character art can seem very daunting and not beginner friendly if you don't know a lot about digital art like I did when I was first starting out. For reference, this was the first 3D model I made and textured. I made this around a year ago. And at this point, it's considered lost media because I don't have the original file. I just have this ominous screenshot of the really messed up UVs. Compared with current day, this is some of the 3D character artwork that I've done since then. As you can see, very fast, dramatic improvements made within the last year. Honestly, improvements that I didn't think were possible purely because the process seems so complicated. But today I just want to break things down, make it a little bit easier to digest and understand what actually goes into 3D character art, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. I know I definitely could have used something like this. I was very mystified by character art before I started or knew anything about it, because there is kind of a lot that goes into it. I just want to give a overview of the process, or hopefully provide some clarity about what character art even is. This is really just going to be a crash course of the workflow, not a tutorial, but there are plenty of helpful tutorials out there on YouTube for whatever 3D software you're planning on using. The first step of my process is really taking the time to analyze the concept art. So maybe this is something you created. In my case, this is concept art that was given to me for a game that I'm working on called Suck It Up, Wishlist on Steam. I like to do draw-overs of concept art to break down the simple shapes so that I can easily translate them into 3D. The way that I do that is analyzing the shapes that make up this character and thinking about what 3D objects would best represent each part of this. Staying true to the concept art is extremely important, especially if you're doing a really stylized character. But it's kind of up to me to interpret which pieces of this character are actually going to be made into 3D geometry. So for the little angry symbol at the top of the character, I really liked that and I thought it added a lot of personality, so I made sure to include that in the final character model. And the other side of this is thinking about which pieces I'm going to model and which pieces I'm going to have to sculpt. Now, depending on the complexity of the character, it may all be modeled or it may all be sculpted. But for a super stylized character like this, it's generally easiest and keeps things cleanest if you model as much as possible. So I try and think about which parts I'll have to bring into Zbrush and sculpt. Even though this character is quite angular, there are still a few organic shapes here and there. And in my opinion, organic shapes are a lot easier to create in a digital sculpting software such as Zbrush. So I decided to complete the head, hands, and angry symbol in Zbrush. The other things I had to consider for this project were which parts of this character are going to be completely drawn on and not geometry. So, for example, the little pocket square, I had to think about whether or not I wanted it to actually be 3D or just something that I did after the fact with the textures. I also really had to heavily consider how I wanted to approach the face. Because this character has such a distinct expression, I didn't know how well that would translate with our art style if I wanted to make it three-dimensional. I decided that making the faces entirely drawn on in texturing would make them easier to read from far away and keep with the very simplistic style of our game. Now on to the creation of the 3D model. So a 3D software like Zbrush allows you to work with a really high polygon mesh and almost manipulate it like you would actual clay. I like to think about this specific part of the process as a sketch. It is very gestural. This part of the process is mainly about taking my block out and seeing how I like the layout of things, seeing how I like the shapes. The game I created this character for is a little bit top-down, isometric, So when I was sculpting these characters, I had to take into account the angle that the camera would be at. Some of the shapes that I was creating originally, I realized were not translating super well and were not very readable from the high camera angle. So I had to go back and refine my basic shapes. After the sculpting portion of the process is done, I export my models from Zbrush and take them into Maya. It's a lot easier to make stylized characters in a modeling software such as Maya. Instead of working with really high poly, complex meshes, you're able to work very intentionally with simple geometry. So you can keep your meshes very true to the concept art and also very low poly, which is ideal for games. For a more complicated or realistic character, the standard practice will look somewhat more like creating the majority of the meshes in Zbrush and then importing all of that into Maya and almost using that as a template for your modeling through a process called retopology. Retopology is the manual process of lowering your polygon count, and thankfully these characters that I made for Suck It Up are already pretty low poly, so the step was not needed. After the modeling portion of your process is completed, it is time to create something called UVs for your character. If you're not familiar with the concept of UVing, all it really is taking the surface area of your model and unfolding it so that it lies completely flat. And this lets you apply all your textures onto your model. Think of it like all the wrapping paper that is required to cover your present. You want to make sure that you can cut and unfold your UVs in such a way that it allows for the most surface area to be present on one square's worth of space. A huge benefit to our very simple art style for Suck It Up was that I was not required to unwrap really complicated shapes. So the UVing process was quite simple, and I would recommend that for starting out. Because all the textures for these characters were completely hand painted by me, I didn't have to worry about extremely clean or proper UVing because there was no need for any tileable textures or materials. And with that, let's talk about texturing. In this case, texturing involves me importing my model and UVs into a software such as Substance Painter. And what Substance Painter lets me do is literally just rotate the mesh and paint all over the 3D surface. In my opinion, this was the easiest part of the 3D character art process to learn because it really was so intuitive. In a software like Substance Painter, all it really involves is creating different layers to add color or different textures onto the surface of your model, depending on what kind of art style you're going for. In this case, these characters were extremely simple. The only layers I was adding were color layers, which allowed me to create the illusion of shadows using different tones and hues. In this case, I was lucky enough to be working with concept artists that had already planned out the colors for each part of the model. All I was doing was dragging and dropping colors from the corresponding areas of the concept art into each layer of my Substance Painter file. After that, I went in and hand drew everything, again, really paying close attention to the concept art so I could stay true to the spirit of the character. The only times I would take small creative liberties would be to consider the angle of the camera. So for Suck It Up, because the player camera is at such a high angle, I had to make sure that the face was going to be readable and not be too tilted down. It's really fun that this process is similar no matter what style of character you're doing. Even for my extremely detailed characters, I'm still using layers, I'm still layering colors and textures, and I think it is super enjoyable and fun. After this process, it's as simple as exporting your textures and putting them into your engine along with your 3D model. 3D character modeling for games doesn't always need to be super complicated or detailed. Oftentimes, simple models with strong shape language and texturing can be just as compelling as very complicated characters. I know this was a very simple overview of the pipeline, so if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to join our games Discord server. My team and I are still learning to grow as artists and designers, so we really value any feedback or engagement from our community. Thank you for watching.